Okay, and we have officially started. We will give it a few minutes to let folks join.
Sounds good. Give folks a minute to join. A nice Tuesday evening webinar. And for folks that are joining that are in Sacramento, there's a meeting at 5:30, very similar topic. So maybe we can get a link to that. All right. I mean, he was not bothering us at all. In the moment we're about to start the webinar, he like moseys over, right? That's the nature of these things. So I'm going to get us started. Thank you everyone for coming to our webinar today. My name is Naila Pope-Hardin. I am the Executive Director of ClimatePlan. For folks that are coming in to the meeting, it would be great if you could just introduce yourself in the chat, maybe your name, your org, and the region you're located in, would be great. And we'll just give it just a few more seconds so folks can trickle in. People can get comfortable in their seat. And time. Oh, chat is disabled. Oh no. Okay. I apologize for that. Well, we'll just hop in. My name is Naila Pope-Hardin. I'm the Executive Director of ClimatePlan. For folks who are unfamiliar, ClimatePlan is a statewide org that is a coalition of about 60 organizations across the state. Our organizations run from small volunteer-run organizations to some of the big national organizations. The through line for every member of ClimatePlan is that we are focused on transportation, land use, climate, housing, environmental justice, and we believe that like one single organization is not going to be responsible for reducing our missions, that we need to come together as a coalition to make that happen. ClimatePlan, so part of the way that this webinar started, or the idea for this started, is because one of the beautiful things about having a statewide organization that also focuses on a regional scale is that we get to see what's happening on the ground, and also we get to see the way that statewide policy is being translated and kind of trickles down to the ground, and we are able to bring real world partners who are working on the ground to be able to share those experiences with grass top orgs, technical experts, and we're just a really good mix of the right policy folks to have in a room. And so in our conversations with folks in regions and through our own experience, we noticed that this year in particular, we've been tracking what was happening in San Diego around their ballot measure that didn't make it on the ballot. In Sacramento, there was a ballot measure that is on the ballot that was concerning to a lot of environmental groups. And we started to connect the dots and say, you know, there is definitely something going on around local ballot initiatives and their ability to raise funds for transportation that doesn't align with our missions, and in some cases can be greenwashing. And so we just had a bunch of concerns and decided to put together this webinar. Some other things that ClimatePlan's tracking that I'll just call out are, while this is going on, we have these ballot measures. In our advocacy, we see the state moving in the right direction in a lot of cases. The state is really trying to put, trying to add like complete streets projects and projects that have co-benefits. There's the AB 285 reports that came out that said we need to dramatically shift the way that our transportation programs are administered, and the state has been making progress. In terms of some of the biggest funding programs, they now have equity guidelines that are a part of them, so that we can try and have more equitable projects. But again, if it's a local ballot measure, they don't have to follow the same rules, and therefore have the problems of essentially getting regions to miss their emissions mark. The other thing that we've been doing a lot at ClimatePlan is what we've been calling our Decolonizing Transportation Funding Program. And part of it is transportation funding is super complicated, really convoluted. And even for advocates that are working on it daily, we still struggle to understand how transportation funding works. And so we've been doing a lot of work to kind of demystify and break that down. In the chat, Moyes just put our transportation funding report card. Highly recommend folks look at that. We took 10 transportation programs across the state and broke it down for how it addresses our climate equity and public health values, and gave them a grade. And that just helps break down, like, is our funding actually doing the things that we want to do? Are we funding transportation projects that are going to hurt our environment, disconnect communities, or are we actually doing what we need to do with our funding? So in advance of this webinar, we put together a fact sheet because while the Climate Plan Network is beautiful, big, and vast, we know that everybody might not be issue experts on local sales tax measures. So Nicole Chang and Climate Plan staff put together the fact sheet that just got dropped in the chat. It has some interesting tidbits. The ones that I'll call out are $4 billion a year are raised in California because of local sales tax measures. So that's $4 billion that don't necessarily have to be aligned with our GHG emissions. And what we find is about 60% of that funding goes towards roads, 30% towards transit. Hold on. There we go. 30% towards transit. Can I bribe you with fruit snacks? It looks like I can. 30% goes towards transit and the other 10% active transportation. Another thing that's interesting on that fact sheet is we have 27 sales tax measures across the state, 3 of them being permanent. And what you'll hear today from our amazing speakers are that regions across the state are trying to implement a lot more sales tax on citizens. And we just want to have a conversation about how to make that as equitable, as fair, as climate friendly as possible. So I am extremely excited about this conversation today, probably even more so excited to go off video so that I can tend to the 3-year-old. I will also just throw out that we know, if folks are tracking this in the state, we know that LA has had some really good successes, and we don't have a speaker from LA here because what we want to talk about for the purpose of this conversation is really get to like what's happening currently, but also like how do we step in for ballot measures that may be going in a direction we're not too happy about. So in future conversations, I think we may invite folks from LA to talk about their measures down there. But for here, we just really wanted to focus on what's happening in San Diego, Sacramento, and the Central Valley. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Sandy to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Naila. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sandy Naranjo. I'm the policy advocate for ClimatePlan, and I'm so proud to introduce our first set of speakers from San Diego. So we'll be hearing from our leaders from San Diego 350, Mittermiller and Steve Gelb, who have for years have been advocating for transportation justice here in the San Diego region. And so they are going to share their experiences of their advocacy and also on how they've transitioned the idea of making sure we fund good transportation projects. So I'm going to pass it to B and Steve to share with us on their advocacy and what's going on in San Diego.
Thanks, Sandy. It's a real pleasure to be here and talk about this ballot issue because the experience is quite a crazy one, and I'm eager to have us open up this conversation. So B and I are going to be speaking about the recent ballot initiative that was organized by labor, business, and environmental groups to support the regional transportation plan that was put forward and approved by the San Diego Association of Governments in December 2021. That plan was a significant turn from previous plans. It's one that we supported because it turned away from highways and towards transit and active transportation. If it had been approved, it would have raised the county sales tax by 0.5%, with most of the funds earmarked for transit. So we'll talk about how it came about, why it failed, and what the plans are for the future. So B, can you start us off by explaining the history and context in which this ballot initiative emerged?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Steve. And hello, everybody. First of all, we need to go back to 2017 when the state legislature passed AB 805. This allowed government transportation agencies to impose taxes for funding transportation projects through ballot measures. MTS, that's San Diego's agency that operates trolleys and the buses in the city, well, in the county, excuse me. MTS was the first to jump onto this opportunity in 2018, and it began the process in order to get it on the 2020 ballot. Polling indicated that there was public support for raising taxes to support better transit in San Diego. And as Steve was saying, well, excuse me, take that back. The initiative was named Elevate San Diego. So MTS had extensive public outreach, and things were looking pretty good, but then the pandemic hit, and MTS had to end the campaign in April of 2020 in order to respond to the public health challenge and to ensure that the essential service of transit would continue. After the Sandag Regional Plan passed in December 2021, the scope and expense of fulfilling the promise of what they called the 5 big moves, because it was 5 separate entities that all worked together to make this incredible system, which we supported. It was clear that a lot of money would be needed. In fact, $162.5 billion. Because ballot measures created by government agencies required 2/3 of voters to approve them, the attractiveness of a citizens' initiative became apparent. A yes vote of only 50% plus 1 of voters are needed to pass a citizens' initiative. Labor, environmentalists, and equity advocates all supported the idea of a citizens' initiative to support public transportation. So Steve, how about if you tell us about the organizing process for the ballot initiative?
Yeah, and this is where it gets hard to believe that we failed. The initiative was created by a coalition of business, environmental, and labor groups. The environmental groups were the Environmental Health Coalition and the Climate Action Campaign. The business and labor groups ponied up $1.3 million to support the campaign. On the business side, we had HNTB Corporation and Flatiron Construction, both of which are involved in building transportation infrastructure. On the labor side were the Southwest Regional Council of Carpenters, International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers 569, and Laborers Union 89. Some in the labor union movement had to be persuaded that environmental infrastructure was a good thing and would create jobs, because they were just thinking that, you know, build highways, and that's good for us. But they were convinced. So polling was done to make the message appealing. And the result was the title, which was Let's Go San Diego. And the slogan, yes for traffic relief, period, transit, period, and jobs. Of course, the traffic relief would be from more transit, not from more roads. So the measure called for a 0.5% sales tax, but we did not emphasize that, obviously, in the messaging. The messaging focused on infrastructure improvements, including fixing existing roads and the building out of transit. As a person who is asking people for signatures, I learned to vary my pitch depending on what the person's interest was that I was talking to. So some people were susceptible to an environmental justice and environmental justice community pitch, where other people only wanted to fix potholes. The campaign needed to get 112,000 valid signatures. and set a target of 165,000. Of those, 155,000 were going to be captured by paid signature gatherers. And there are these big companies that are in this business. This is a huge capitalist enterprise now. There were also 10,000 that were to be collected by volunteers like Bee and me and other people in the environmental and labor movements. There was a staff person organizing the volunteer groups, and she created motivational tools like a group and individual leaderboard that was updated every week, as well as swag, including buttons, stickers, and t-shirts. And the red trolley was the symbol of the campaign. And there's a t-shirt that was created for the campaign.
Steve, not to interrupt, we couldn't see the t-shirt on frame.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Step back, step back.
Did you see it?
It's out of focus, Steve.
Okay, let's forget about the t-shirt.
It's a very cool, it was a very cool t-shirt.
It's an amazingly cool t-shirt. But with all of this money, with all of this effort, with all of this excitement, given the fact that this was a very good measure, Dee, tell us why it failed.
Okay. Sadly, yes, it failed. First of all, the large voter turnout expected in the presidential election of 2024 meant that the number of signatures required to get it on the ballot was far greater than what is usually needed. That was the first thing. Next, because of the pandemic, a lot of the events that we were counting on to be happening, where we could go and just hit on a lot of people, they weren't happening. So that really hurt us. Even so, the campaign believed that it had reached its target for the number of signatures needed, but when the registrar of voters counted them, they were short 23,000. So the missing signatures were not from the volunteers, but from the paid signature gatherers. And we learned that there were gatherers who had multiple petitions to sign. I ran into one person who had, I think, 8, whole stack of them. And the campaign learned a little too late that it had to pay more per signature to avoid being placed at the bottom of the pile when there's more than one petition being circulated. But the volunteer organizations did really well. Our group and the Environmental Health Coalition both contributed 2,000 signatures. So Steve, now it's your turn to tell everybody what's up next for this initiative.
Okay, I will. And I just want to correct one mistake that is my fault, not Bee's. The number of signatures that you have to gather is based on the previous election. It was the 2022 election, I'm sorry, the 2020 election, which was a presidential election, which so many people voted who hadn't voted before, which made our goal much higher than it normally would have been. And I'm the perp who put 2024 into Bee's talking point, so I apologize for that. So the same coalition plans to work to get a similar initiative on the ballot in 2024. And because 2022 election will be an off year, the target will be lower, so it should be easier. The need for the initiative is even greater because Sandag had to back away from a road use charge due to demagoguery and political pressure from the right wing. Much that we learned in this campaign can be used in 2024, but one thing we need to do is to prepare for a vicious campaign against this initiative that has already been started by Carl DeMaio of Reform California. Even when this initiative came out, he called it, quote, a massive sales tax created by special interests for a transit project that no one needs or wants. So we know that there will be a struggle, even though most people do support these measures. We know there'll be a lot of misinformation and money on the other side that will be difficult to overcome. So thank you.
Thank you, Steve and B, for sharing that. And we're going to go ahead and move north to Sacramento. And I'm going to introduce to you all Ann Stausboll, who is the former chair of the Mayor's Commission on Climate Change. And she will share with us about what is going on in Sacramento. Ann, it's all yours.
Great, thanks. And hi, everyone. We have quite a different story from Sacramento. Here we have citizens' so-called transportation measure that's heading to the voters in November. And I'll give you an overview of the measure and then talk about some of the problems why talk about the politics going on behind the scenes, and then just some thoughts on what the campaign might look like heading into November. So this measure is spearheaded by a committee called the Committee for a Better Sacramento. The major funders are two very large sprawl developers and the California Alliance for Jobs, which you may know represents heavy construction and construction workers. So as a citizens measure, it'll only require a 50% vote as opposed to the 2/3. And what the measure would do is impose an additional 0.5-cent sales tax for the next 40 years, raising an anticipated $8.5 billion for countywide transportation projects. And those projects would include transit, but the measure leans very heavily, about 60%, to roads and freeways. The committee has gathered the signatures using paid people and qualified for the ballot. And our Sacramento Transportation Authority, STA, is meeting tomorrow, and it's a ministerial act, but they'll be doing the act to formally submit the measure to the voters. So before I talk more about the measure, just a little context on prior Sacramento County transportation measures. Our original countywide sales tax, Measure A, was passed over 30 years ago, and it set up STA, the Sacramento Transportation Authority, as the administrator to provide locals with the matching funds to leverage state and federal dollars. 2 years ago, in 2020, there was a proposed initiative to add another 0.5-cent sales tax, and negotiated language in that provided that any project funded would have to be included in our regional planning process, which an organization called SACOG oversees for a 6-county region that includes Sacramento. And their job is to ensure that the state mandated regional GHG target is met. That measure didn't go forward. It was a government measure, and the polling showed that it was unlikely to pass. So it was withdrawn. Our current 2022 measure doesn't include the language that would require that SACOG regional planning organization oversight, which is a big problem. And the measure would fund at least 26 projects that aren't included in our current plan. So it really undermines our region's longstanding transportation planning. So what else is wrong with the measure? I'll highlight 3 issues, although there are more. First, at the heart of why the developers are funding this measure is $300 million would go to completing a 34-mile expressway. It's called the Capital Southeast Connector in currently undeveloped lands. And that new expressway will incentivize sprawl in this undeveloped area east of Sacramento, making it much less likely that we'll see investment in sustainable infill development that we really need. And over time will induce more traffic and pollution. Second problem, as I mentioned, the measure prioritizes car travel with 60% of the funding going to roads and freeways instead of advancing a more forward-looking mobility policy that promotes active transportation and transit. And third, our regional planning organization, SACOG, issued an analysis and found that if this measure passes and these projects are funded, the region, which is 6 counties, which goes beyond the Sacramento County, will likely fall short of meeting its greenhouse gas reduction target. And that, of course, would also jeopardize the entire region's ability to get federal and state funding for housing and transportation. So lots of issues. So when this measure first surfaced, the discussion among environmental groups, and Naila was part of that, among environmental groups and our Sacramento leaders focused on how are we going to oppose this measure? How are we going to fight it? And we even talked about whether there could be a competing Sacramento city measure that focused on climate. Then in the spring, our mayor initiated a negotiation between SACOG and the measure's proponents in an effort to find a compromise. His view being that if the measure passed, it was important to try to salvage it. So he wanted to find a compromise that would ensure that the GHG target would be met. So in June, the mayor presented a term sheet to our SACOG board stating that he would support the measure under certain terms. And the main points were that projects not currently included in our regional plan would be have to be mitigated, and that there'd be a process to determine the mitigation. The desire of everyone, I think, well, on our side, is that SACOG would have a role and determine that mitigation. But the language in this term sheet was not clear as to who would have the final say about what the mitigation would be. The SACOG board approved the concept and left details to be worked out in an MOU between the Transportation Authority, the Regional Planning Authority, the Proponents Committee, and the Joint Powers Authority that oversees the connector. And I'm sorry, I know this is a lot of technical, but this is kind of how Sacramento works. So that really brings us to where we are today. This proposed MOU among the parties is on the board agenda for our Transportation Authority tomorrow. And it's similar to the original proposal in that the intent is to require mitigation for projects, but there's ambiguity about where the decision-making authority would lie for that. And we don't have a lot of faith in that. And interestingly, the connector itself won't be signing the MOU. So in a separate vote tomorrow, the Transportation Authority will be sending the measure to the voters. If there is an MOU, that will not be part of the measure, of course, because that's already been qualified separately. So the idea is that would be reflected in the proponent's ballot argument. So turning now to what the campaign might look like. The proponents, not surprisingly, are very well organized, well funded. They've done a masterful job of greenwashing this measure. They also have swag and sweatshirts and things. All their messages are around climate, improving air quality, reducing congestion. If people who ran into the folks collecting the signatures thought this was a climate measure. Since there's funding for transit in the measure, that has created a dilemma for some voters and groups that support transit. And the other thing going for them, of course, it only will take 50% to pass, which isn't that high of a hurdle. What would it take to defeat the measure? Presumably some percentage of voters will vote no, just on the basis that it's a tax. Our data shows it would be probably about 25% of the voters. The remaining 25% that we would need for opposition would likely come primarily from Sacramento city voters, as opposed to the outlying areas that are more conservative. And we would look at messages like anti-development, climate, and environmental issues. However, the proponents have already co-opted those issues, so a big challenge for us would be also debunking those messages. As of now, not aware of any formal opposition campaign that's been being like formally led by anyone, but a group of environmental organizations put out a strong opposition statement. I think Moise just dropped that in the chat. It's a live document, so both organizations and individuals can continue to sign on. Organizations like ClimatePlan are providing education on the measures, which is critical. And the media coverage that we've seen so far has actually been very fair, which has been nice to see. So bottom line, the measures going forward, this political compromise MOU, if it comes to pass, is a step in the right direction. It makes it better if the measure is passed, but it doesn't solve the underlying issues and wouldn't be part of the actual measure that people are voting on. The measure overall, if passed, will take us backwards, not forward, and it'll threaten our climate goals that are already in serious jeopardy. So thanks for inviting me. Thanks for listening. And I look forward to working with everyone here on figuring out how to tackle all this.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you for your presentation. We're going to now go to the Central Valley. We're going to be hearing from our climate leader in the Central Valley, Olivia Seideman from the Leadership Council. So Olivia, can you share with us what's going on in the Central Valley? I know it sounds like there's several transportation measures going on. So can you break it down for us?
Yeah, and I'm going to talk about 4 different measures. So I'm going to try to go quickly here. Please bear with me. And the first 2 I'm going to talk about are both transportation sales tax measures. In Fresno County, Measure C, and Madera County, Measure T, and they're very similar measures. So I'm going to kind of talk about them as a whole and then talk a little bit about the differences. So both Measure C and Measure T are current half-cent sales taxes for the entire counties of Fresno and Madera, respectively, that were implemented in 2006 and expire at the end of 2026, beginning of 2027. And there have been pushes, even though we still have years before these measures are going to expire, to get them on the ballot this year. There's been robust community opposition to both. The planned transit projects they're planning on funding are ones that include highway expansions. They do not invest in public transit. They do not invest in greenhouse gas reducing transportation projects. For example, in Fresno County, the current Measure C that will expire in 2026 allocates 19.6% to transit, and the new proposed Measure C only allocates 12%. So we're actually seeing a decrease in the percentage going to transportation spending, which we all know with climate change here already, we're in the middle of a heat wave in the Central Valley right now. This is a step in the wrong direction. And in Madera County, Measure T, only 3% are allocated for public transportation projects and only 3% to clean technologies. And so Measure C in Fresno County is a 30-year tax, and Measure T in Madera County is actually a forever tax. So they are going to bake into law in perpetuity these really bad climate policies for transportation programs in Madera County. And so where we are now with them, actually, the Madera County Board of Supervisors is voting on it today. I think that my colleague's still at the BOS meeting. It still hasn't come up. And we expect that to be approved, and then it'll be on the ballot this November. In Fresno County, the BOS will vote on it on August 9th. We expect it to pass. It's already been voted on at both FCOG, our MPO, in Fresno County, and the Fresno County FCTA, Fresno County Regional Transportation Authority. And so in Fresno, we're seeing something especially kind of egregious where at the FCOG board meeting, the FCOG's proposed Measure C plan was actually kind of usurped by this new plan that the mayor of Fresno brought out at the last minute, this kind of mayor's plan. And the first time anyone on FCOG had seen it, any members of the public had seen it, was when he proposed it at the FCOG meeting a couple weeks ago. And so some folks who were calling in remotely hadn't even looked at the plan, and they still voted to approve it and send it to the ballot. And there was some confusion over even the language they voted on, because they wanted to use the mayor's plan, but a different definition of transit-oriented development. So they put in some weird filler language that we're not even sure was kind of legal, because folks didn't even know what they were voting on. So that's one of the, I think, biggest problems in Measure C. But one of the things across the board, Leadership Council, the organization I work for, was on the executive committees for both Measure C and Measure T. And we dropped out of the process because there was no robust community engagement. We raised issues all along the way and were not heard by the rest of the executive committee members. The community engagement has been abysmal. They did a lot of it during COVID when people weren't leaving, their houses. It wasn't safe to meet in person. They've not met community where they are. Even the FCOG meeting for Measure C, they had to reschedule it because they had so many technical difficulties with Zoom and translation that no one could participate. So we, folks mobilized, came out to FCOG, and then 30 minutes into the meeting, they canceled it and moved it to the following week because they just couldn't meet they didn't have their technology or their translation sorted out. And so because these are specific taxes, both take 2/3 to vote, 2/3 to pass. The polling numbers are pretty okay for them right now. I think the last Measure T one I saw was 73%. So once these are officially on the ballot, which we are very much expecting them to be, I think community is probably going to mobilize in opposition to both of these taxes. Again, Madera County's is a forever tax, so they're locking in these bad transportation policies forever, basically, unless they go through the process of repealing it, which is a huge barrier. And then Measure C is a 30-year tax, so it's locking in these bad policies for 30 years. And again, they're prioritizing highway widenings and freight corridors over public transportation, improving roads in disadvantaged communities, GHG and pollution reducing transit policies. So we've seen these huge problems. The next one I'm going to talk about is down in Kern County, which has already approved for the ballot a 1% sales tax in unincorporated communities only that is supposed to fund general services. And so this 1% tax, it will only be voted on by folks in the unincorporated communities because it's billed as a general tax. It only takes a 50% threshold to pass. But even though a general tax, we've already, we know, the county has already basically said what they're going to spend it on. So we know that the sheriff and the DA have really been pushing for this to fund law enforcement. And the other big thing is, so Kern County is an oil county, and some of the language from the measure specifically discusses the extreme anti-oil policies at the state that they're seeing as a revenue loss. So they want to invest in carbon capture and storage technology and build up the basically create a huge industry for CCS technology in Kern County. And CCS, we have a lot of really big concerns. Oftentimes it's a net emitter when you do a full life cycle analysis. There are problems with leakage and pipes, and potential leakage into water. And there are a lot of concerns about how CCS technology will exacerbate environmental injustices. So we're seeing this as, a really conservative county that has long relied on oil, really pushing this as a necessary revenue generator, since they're losing tax revenues from the oil industry as the state, pushes climate-friendly policies. So that's a really interesting dynamic. It's in the resolution. They're very explicit that this is, in part replacing oil in Kern County. And another thing they've cited is, solar as an alternative to oil just doesn't raise the same revenues because of all the state incentives to increase solar production. So it's become kind of a weird battleground for very specific, kind of just transition. It's kind of a way that the county is really pushing back against kind of just transition. So the last one I'm going to talk about, and I'll do this one really quickly because this one is a little less climate focused, but it's also called Measure C in Merced City. And it's basically, again, the extension of an existing tax that's billed again as like general services. So it has a 50% threshold, but we know that the current iteration of Measure C, over 90% goes to law enforcement, and like a tiny sliver goes to like public works and parks, which, you know, investing in parks could be a really good climate friendly policy. And they kind of, you know, tout Measure C as a funder of parks when really it's a really small sliver of the pie. And a lot of this money is actually going to law enforcement and not climate friendly policies like, you know, increasing green spaces. So yeah, it's really interesting that all across the Central Valley, we're seeing a lot of really similar dynamics in terms of like the counties specifically putting these ballots on the measure that are, you know, embracing really climate unfriendly policies, CCS in down in Kern County, and then the transportation policies in Madera and Fresno counties. And then kind of similarly, but a little different in Merced City. There's been widespread community opposition in Madera and Fresno counties. At FCOG, we had 2.5 hours of public comment where I would say everyone except for 2 people were anti-Measure C. And again, this was a plan that most folks had, no one on FCOG had seen prior to that meeting. The public had not had time to review. And everyone was like, great, thanks so much, community, for coming out. But A, you should have come out sooner, and B, we're not going to listen to you. So it's been really, I think, frustrating in a lot of ways, but also mobilizing, as you know, we are seeing these opportunities to really fight back against these policies. And for Madera and Fresno counties, you know, we really want the counties to step back, do actual community engagement, listen to community priorities, fund road repairs in disadvantaged communities, improve the safety on streets, and invest in public transit. We think there's, you know, obviously there's time. These measures don't expire until 2027, and the county needs to get this right, but they're really not. So yeah, that's kind of the main overview for what's going on in the Valley.
Thank you, Olivia, and thank you, B and Stephen and Anne, for sharing what's happening in your guys' regions. I think one of the things that ClimatePlan focuses on a lot is we say we like to drive transformative change. And one of the ways we do that is ensuring that our spending is aligned with our climate goals. And I think what we can hear here, well, in San Diego, there was a real good faith effort to try and align spending with where we need to go in our emissions. And I think there was a question in the chat about, like, why are we talking about transportation and local spending? $18 billion of our budget every year in California goes towards transportation. As I said in the beginning, we have $4 billion that's raised outside of that mechanism through local taxes. There is a ton of money going to shooting our emissions in the foot. That's not funny. There's a ton of money going towards road widening, highway widening, and projects that are disconnecting communities, projects that are increasing emissions, projects that aren't making communities safer or healthier. And so one of the things that I think we were hoping to get out of this is, I think as a staff team and ClimatePlan, we were just like, what do we do? What are the solutions? And not that we have them, but to really open it up to our network to have a discussion about how do we actually move forward. Earlier this year, there was a bill, AB 2235, which really started to get to the heart of this. But I think we need to come together and all think of solutions about how do we make sure and ensure that citizens initiatives, local governments can't just create projects or do these tax measures, fund these projects outside of people's pockets, and then have that completely shoot our emissions and our future in the foot. So we're going to open it up to questions. Please feel free to put questions in the Q&A feature. If there's a lot of them, some of us can answer them by typing, and then we can get through more questions that way. So that would just help us manage that. But I will pass it to Sandy to ask our first set of questions.
Thank you, Naila. And so we're going to go to our first question, and I'm going to start off with San Diego. The first question, as you know, we've heard that local ballot measures are a way to fund our transportation and the land use projects for better or for worse. Can you share with us how local organizations can ensure that local ballot measures actually fund climate-friendly projects?
Good question. Steve, do you have an answer? I mean,
Well, I mean, one of my thoughts is that this whole process has been so corrupted that it seems that we need to look at the ballot measures because there are more and more of them. They're increasingly co-opted by greenwashing groups or corporate groups that are misleading the public when they pick these names like Citizens for the Environment or something, and they're really for roads. And that's making people be very cynical. And so I don't know what the answer is, but I think there's got to be some reform of this process. So it's just ridiculous to think that you need to raise $1.3 million. And who has that money? Usually it's only going to be corporations. So this is not an answer, but it's just a statement about the mess that we're in. I think most of the ballot measures now are deceitful ones that are working for corporate interests and not for the people. And I don't know how we get out of that situation, but we need to address it, I think.
I think too, an awareness of these ballot measures from the beginning would really be helpful. And also to have your eyes open about what kind of money, as Steve was saying, it takes to make one of these successful. I mean, we learned a lot about how, and Steve alluded to this before, about how it's the groups that have the money to pay for the best paid petition companies that usually end up winning. And it's that's not the way democracy is supposed to work, is it? So what we can do as individuals and as organizations is to educate our communities and let them know what these ballots really mean, and to demystify the language, because it can be very confusing.
Thank you, Steve and B. And I'm going to move to Central Valley. Olivia, can you share with us your perspective on how local organizations can ensure these ballot measures actually fund climate-friendly projects?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to be frank. You know, even when there are EJ orgs like on the executive committees, they're oftentimes sidelined, and we weren't the only CBO that, you know, stepped down from roles on some of these executive committees. I think the biggest thing is, you know, organizing, which can be really hard, but forming like diverse coalitions. In the case of Measure C, we have we've, you know, done a lot of outreach with labor and brought together like a large swath of community organizations, labor, other types of organizations. The League of Women Voters in Fresno County has been really active. We've gotten the local chapter of the Sierra Club involved as well. And so, yeah, I think that's a big piece of it is, you know, organizing, and it's time intensive in a lot of ways. But when you have local governments like this that are, you know, are going to put these types of measures on the ballots, you end up playing defense, I think, a lot of the time. I think another thing that is possible, and I know Naila mentioned this with 223 AB 2237, but, you know, I think one piece around legislation at the state level that can kind of add in protections for local jurisdictions who are not going to do right by their constituents. We've seen this time and again in the Valley. For example, this is a little unrelated, not a ballot measure, but, you know, Fresno County turned down money that the public health department had gotten to build climate resilience. They'd already secured the funding, but, you know, we have governments in place that are just really anti-climate. And so I think to the extent that we can, you know, leverage what tools we have at the statewide level, where there's, you know, oftentimes maybe more climate friendly atmosphere to try to protect against these types of measures, is really important. And I mean, you know, there are other issues as well in the Central Valley with like sustainable community strategies not always being super great, and that, you know, harming us a little bit in the transportation realm, because technically like Measure C in Fresno County is aligned with the SCS that FCOG put out. So, you know, it's, I think, starting kind of at the source and at the state level, putting whatever protections in we can to protect communities, to protect against these types of anti-community local government activities is really crucial.
thank you, Olivia. And I know that B and Steve have to step out. And so, Anne, same question for you. How can you share for local organizations to ensure that they can fund climate-friendly transportation projects?
Thanks. I just wanted to say one thing in response to the first question that came up, which is that it's rumored at least that the Jarvis folks are going to run this year a ballot initiative that would eliminate the ability to use the citizens measure for a tax. So I guess we'll know soon whether they're actually putting that on or not, but the whole thing may go away. But in terms of local groups, I've kind of lost faith in the local process a little bit. I mean, I guess where I'm feeling is like it's time to really focus more at the state level, and maybe we've pinned too much hope on our local leaders. And, I don't know the entire state, but that's kind of my view about what I've seen in Sacramento. And I think it's reinforced by what I've heard today. But in terms of what we can do locally, I think we need to think bigger about who our allies are. We actually, someone mentioned the League of Women Voters. Ours is very strong on climate as well. And I don't think we've really tapped into that. And we've got to figure out a way to get some business involved. We haven't done a really good job of that. And the same goes for labor. So I think we've got to focus at the local level really on building our coalition. It's not strong enough right now.
I'm going to hop in, Anne, and just me too everything you're saying, because I think one of the things that's really telling about this panel too is if we just leave it up to local advocacy groups, what we'll have is a bunch of climate advocacy groups running themselves rampant across the state to fight back these measures, when what would be more effective is some type of guidance from statewide policy. I just also wanted to call out that the fact sheet that we posted earlier includes some of that. So one of the things that Nicole did was pull out different laws that actually govern ballot measures around their transparency, how they get on the ballot, and some of those facts. So that's really helpful. Sorry, Sandy, I'll pass it back to you for more questions.
Yeah, thank you, Naila. And I know there's been a question about ballot measures and the percentage. And Olivia, I feel like you wanted to address that.
Yeah, just really quickly, I tried to address it in the chat, but I want to make sure it's clear. And this relates back to Prop 218, which was passed in 1996, and says that voter approval is required before local tax increases. And so there's a majority vote to raise general taxes for general government purposes, and then a 2/3 vote to raise special taxes, so special taxes for a specific purpose. And so, for example, Measure C and Measure T are both specific purposes geared specifically towards transportation, but the Kern County ballot measure and also Measure C in the Merced City are billed as like general needs taxes. So they're not actually allocated or earmarked for anything when they're passed, but we can look at, what government officials are saying or what historically has been used if it's a renewal in the case of Merced City to have a general sense of what the government is likely going to spend these taxes on. So even though they're not technically earmarked for anything in particular, they're considered general taxes. And the 2/3 threshold does not apply to taxes on ballots by citizen petition drive. And there was actually Measure P in Fresno a few years ago, which was a citizens initiative that one of our partner orgs, Building Healthy Communities, put on the ballot. It was challenged in the courts because it only had a 50% threshold to pass. And then the courts found that, that it did not apply to citizens ballot initiatives, the 2/3 threshold. So I hope that clears it up, and I'm happy to talk about that a little more if folks still have questions.
Yeah, and so to clarify, San Diego and Sacramento are citizens initiatives, only need 50%. All of the ones in the Central Valley need 2/3 vote because they are proposed by local jurisdictions and bodies or public bodies.
Thank you. And looking at the time, I'm going to take one question I actually see on the chat, and specifically directed towards Sacramento. And its question is, how is Sacramento's Measure U funding being used? So I'll pass that to you, Anne, on that question.
I'm really not an expert on that. I think Naila or Moise might be better to answer that.
Yeah, I want to say Measure U is a general tax, but that one is going directly to public safety. Moise, you unmuted.
Yeah, Sacramento's Measure U was marketed as an inclusive economic development measure. I do know that some funding for it has been used for public safety department. I think most recently, was used. I think there was a $40 million supplement to the Sacramento Police Department. I know that the Measure U committee is very active in Sacramento.
Yeah, not super related to climate or transportation, raising funding for climate or transportation work. All right, so Sandy, I was supposed to create a poll. I didn't, so I'm just gonna poll folks out loud, if you don't mind. So we would love to continue this conversation, move it forward, figure out what the next step of what the next step is. I would love if folks could just put in the chat what you think the next step should be. I'll throw out some possible solutions, but feel free to offer your own suggestions. I think having a conversation about what are the solutions to fund transportation, climate-friendly transportation, active transportation infrastructure, and transit across the state is one of the conversations that we can have next. I think having a conversation about what needs to happen at a statewide level is another conversation we can have next. We can also have a conversation about what type of coalitions and where we seek funding to be able to fight some of these measures, because I know Anne alluded to it, but when these measures are already going and approved on the ballot, the amount of a machine that you have to build to be able to stop them, it takes a lot of capacity, a lot of funding, a lot of resources. So we can have a conversation about what that would actually take and mean to fight back some of these ballot measures or put our own on the ballot. So any of those options, what are folks thinking would be helpful? So while you guys are throwing that in the chat, I'm going to pass it to Sandy to do other closing out things.
Yeah, thank you, Naila, and I love seeing what's going on in the chat. So as we close out, I do want to mention an important legislative bill, which is co-sponsored by ClimatePlan, authored by Assemblymember Laura Friedman, and that is AB 2438. AB 2438 will codify the Nuisance Administration's commitment of the Climate Action Plan for Transportation Infrastructure, CAPDI, into our California transportation programs. There was a recent AB 285 report published this year that found that our transportation funding and our planning is not aligned with our climate goals. And we know we need to start aligning because we do not have enough time. The bill is headed to the Senate Probes Committee August 8th. If you would like to be involved and like to advocate for the bill and be a champion for the bill, you can go ahead and sign up on our listserv, which will be dropped in the chat, but that is coming up very soon. And so if you want to be involved with the Climate Plan Network, we do have regional tables across the state. We have a table in Sacramento. We have a table in San Diego. If you'd like to be involved, you can go ahead and email me directly. If you'd like to be more involved in the statewide level, you can also email me and we'll make sure to provide you any of that information. And we definitely thank you for participating in today's webinar. We'll look forward to all your ideas you're posing in the chat, and there will definitely be a next step. So thank you all.
Yeah, you're muted if you're talking.
Yep, let's give it a few seconds for the chat to close out. Thank you so much, Anne and Olivia, for coming and talking to us today.
Thank you for having me. This was really fun.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
Important stuff. Important stuff. All right, Climate Plan team, let's meet on my Zoom to a debrief. Thank you, everyone.